The heavy rain pounded against the windows as the small town of Oakwood remained quiet under the gray sky. Inside the empty church, Sarah stood at the back, unnoticed by the few scattered people preparing for the upcoming wedding. She had not set foot in this town for years. To them, she was a ghost, a child who had been discarded, a mistake that was swept under the rug. At 13, she had been told that she was no longer welcome, that her life was nothing but a blemish on their perfect community. She could still hear the harsh words echoing in her ears, her mother's tear-filled pleas, her father's cold silence. But today, Sarah was no longer the scared, uncertain girl who had been forced to leave. She had returned, not as a victim, but as someone who had lived, fought, and survived. The years had changed her. The innocence had faded, replaced by a fire that burned deep within her. She was no longer the girl they thought they knew. Today, she was someone they would never expect, someone who would challenge everything they thought they knew about her. Sarah glanced around the church, her eyes scanning the familiar faces. She saw the woman who had been her best friend, now married and with children. She saw the man who had once promised to protect her, now a pillar of the community. And then there was her father, sitting at the front, a proud, older version of the man who had turned his back on her all those years ago. She didn't need to say a word. The mere presence of her would send a shockwave through the town. Sarah knew they would all wonder why she had returned, what had changed in her. What they didn't know was that she was not here to beg for forgiveness. She was here to expose the lies, the secrets, and the betrayals that had kept her away for so long. And as the wedding ceremony began, Sarah stepped forward into the shadows, watching and waiting. Her time had come. The town would finally know the truth. The sound of the organ filled the air as the bride walked down the aisle, her veil covering her face. But Sarah's gaze was fixed on her father. He was smiling, proud, as if nothing had ever happened, as if he hadn't been the one to turn his back on her all those years ago. His eyes never left the bride, but Sarah could see the flicker of regret in his eyes every time he glanced down at his hands, as if remembering the past he had buried. It had been so long since Sarah had allowed herself to feel anything about him. The years of loneliness and pain had been long and hard, but they had shaped her into someone stronger, someone who knew her worth. And yet, even now, her father's indifference hurt more than she wanted to admit. But there was no room for weakness now. Sarah had come too far to let old wounds control her. This was about more than her father's shameful betrayal. It was about the life she had built, the child she had raised on her own, and the scars that had made her who she was today. She wasn't the broken girl they had cast out. She was a mother now, a survivor, and she would not be ignored any longer. As the ceremony continued, Sarah stood there in the back, invisible to everyone but herself. The bride looked out over the guests, her eyes meeting Sarah's for a brief moment. There was something in that glance. Recognition, fear, or perhaps both. Sarah didn't care. This wedding, this perfect little ceremony was a farce. It was built on lies, and today she would bring those lies to the surface. It was time. Time for the truth to be known, time to show everyone who Sarah had become. And as she stepped closer to the front, a feeling of cold determination washed over her. She would not walk away from this. She was not here to make amends. She was here to expose the dark secrets the town had hidden for far too long. The vows were being exchanged, but Sarah could hardly focus on the words. Her mind raced as she thought of the one secret that had driven her back to Oakwood, The secret that, if revealed, would shatter everything. The truth about the man who had once been her protector, who had turned his back on her when she needed him the most. He thought his life had moved on, that his past could stay buried. But Sarah had spent years digging through the rubble of her past. The town's perfect image would crumble, and her return was the catalyst. Sarah had kept silent all these years, but now, standing in this church, she felt the weight of her silence lift. She was no longer afraid of the consequences. She wasn't the scared girl who had been thrown out. She had become someone they could no longer control. She was the truth they had never wanted to face. As the bride and groom exchanged rings, Sarah's eyes narrowed. She knew the bride's secret, too, just as guilty of the betrayal as her father. They had both played their parts in driving Sarah out, in shaming her, and making her believe she was unworthy. But Sarah had learned something over the years. She had learned that there was power in being cast aside, power in surviving when everyone expected her to break. The bride turned her head, and once again her eyes met Sarah's. This time there was no mistaking the fear in her gaze. The facade was crumbling, bit by bit. Sarah could see the tightness in the bride's smile, the tension in her body. She wasn't ready for what was coming, but she would have to face it. Everyone in that room would. Sarah's heart beat faster, the adrenaline rushing through her veins. This was the moment she had waited for, the moment she would confront everything, the lies, the betrayal, the humiliation, and make them all realize the price of turning their backs on her. As the ceremony reached its climax, Sarah stepped forward, her heels clicking on the stone floor, breaking the silence that had settled over the guests. The groom looked up first, his eyes widening when they locked onto her. His face twisted in disbelief, as though he recognized her but couldn't quite place her. Sarah didn't stop. She moved past him, her gaze locked on her father, who had turned pale the moment he saw her approaching. His hand trembled as he gripped the side of the pew, his composure cracking under the weight of the moment. For the first time in years, Sarah saw him as vulnerable, not the pillar of strength he had always tried to portray, but a man caught in his own lie. The people in the room were beginning to notice. Whispers began to spread, but Sarah didn't care. The years of silence had been her own form of control, and now the truth would make them all confront what they had done. Sarah stopped just a few feet away from her father. The room fell silent. The bride's smile faltered, her eyes darting between Sarah and the groom. But she held her ground. There was no turning back now. The moment she had dreaded for years, the moment when the secrets would be exposed, had arrived. And Sarah was no longer afraid. "You thought I was gone." Sarah's voice was steady but laced with years of pain. "You thought you could erase me, cast me aside and pretend I never existed. But here I am." Her father's face went white, his mouth opening and closing as though he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. The guilt and shame were written all over him, but it wasn't enough, not anymore. Sarah had waited too long for him to face the consequences of his actions. "You kicked me out at 13. You abandoned me. And now, here I am, standing before you." Sarah's voice rose, her words cutting through the tension in the room. "But I'm not the same girl who left Oakwood all those years ago. I've lived. I've survived. And now, you're going to pay for the lies you've built your life on." The silence was deafening. The guests stood frozen, not knowing whether to gasp, speak, or flee. The shock on everyone's faces mirrored the turmoil Sarah had lived with for years, But now she was free. The room was still. The only sound was the distant hum of the rain outside and the occasional shuffle of uncomfortable feet. Sarah's words hung in the air like a heavy fog, thickening with every passing second. Her father's face twisted, a mix of fear and regret flickering in his eyes. The guests shifted uneasily, some glancing nervously at each other, others too afraid to make a sound. But Sarah knew this was her moment to turn the tide. She stepped closer to her father, her voice, now quiet but fierce, aimed directly at him. "You never cared for me," she whispered. "Not really. It wasn't about me being a burden. It was about you and your reputation. You couldn't bear the thought of your perfect little life being disrupted, so you sent me away. But you never thought I would come back, did you?" Her father's lips parted, but no words came out. It was as though he had been frozen in place, caught between the guilt of his past and the shame of his present. For all his power, for all his influence, he couldn't speak now. It was too late. "I've spent years keeping silent," Sarah continued, her voice gaining strength with each word. "I've raised my child alone, fought battles you couldn't even begin to understand, and I've become someone you can't control, someone you can't erase. I'm not the scared little girl you thought you could cast out." The room was so quiet, the weight of her words settling like a stone. Sarah turned her gaze from her father to the bride, whose face had gone ashen. The truth, it seemed, was too much for them all to bear. And yet, it had to be known. "You think you've won," Sarah said, her eyes hardening as they fixed on the bride. "But you haven't. You're just another part of the lie." The bride's hands trembled as she tried to steady herself, but Sarah could see the panic in her eyes. She knew. She knew that this wedding, this perfect day, was crumbling, and there was nothing she could do to stop it now. Sarah turned away from her father, facing the rest of the room. Her words were a final declaration. "This isn't just about me. This is about the secrets you've all kept buried for years. This is about the lies that you've all built your lives on." As the last words left her lips, the storm outside seemed to intensify, as if nature itself was echoing her anger, her frustration. It was time to let the truth flood in. The calm had ended. The air in the church felt suffocating, as though everyone was holding their breath, waiting for something to break. Sarah stood tall, unwavering, her back straight as she faced the room, knowing that this was her moment to take back everything she had lost. Her gaze swept over the faces of the guests, many of whom had known her as a child, many of whom had turned their backs on her without a second thought. They were all staring at her now, each one holding their breath, unsure of what would happen next. Her father's face was a portrait of anguish, his eyes filled with a desperation that seemed to have broken through his usual mask of control. He reached out as though to stop her, but Sarah held her ground. He had no power over her anymore. The years of torment, the years of silence, had only made her stronger. She wasn't the little girl who needed him anymore. She was a woman who had fought for everything she had. "You think you can pretend everything is normal," Sarah said, her voice softening but carrying an edge that was hard to ignore. "But it's not. You can't erase what happened, and you can't hide the truth anymore. You thought I would stay gone, that I would be too ashamed to come back and confront you all. But you were wrong." Her words cut through the room like a blade. The people around her were visibly shaken, their faces a mixture of guilt, confusion, and fear. Sarah could see the cracks in their perfect little world, the fear in their eyes that the facade was about to collapse. She turned back to her father, her expression hardening. "You abandoned me. You kicked me out because I was pregnant. You didn't care that I was your daughter. You cared about your reputation, your image. And now, look where it's gotten you. You've built this life, this perfect family on the ashes of the people you hurt." Her father's eyes flickered with something: regret, guilt, or perhaps even a faint trace of fear. But it was too late for apologies, too late for redemption. Sarah had learned long ago that some things couldn't be fixed with a simple apology. The damage had been done. And now it was her turn to make sure everyone knew the truth. She glanced at the bride once more, who was now visibly shaking. Sarah knew the woman was just as guilty as her father. The town's secrets, the web of lies they had all spun to protect themselves, were about to be exposed, and neither of them could hide from it. "I didn't come here to destroy your life," Sarah said, her voice steady. "I came here to make sure you never forget the price of your actions. You'll never get to pretend that I didn't exist. You'll never get to forget the mistakes you made." The silence in the church was deafening, the weight of her words pressing down on everyone in the room. Sarah knew she had just ignited a fire that could never be put out. The truth was out now, and nothing would ever be the same again. The room was so still it felt like the very air had frozen in place. The guests were motionless, their eyes flicking nervously from Sarah to her father, then to the bride. Every single one of them was caught in the web Sarah had woven, and none of them knew how to escape. The lies they had lived by for so long were unraveling before their eyes, and there was no way to deny it any more. Sarah could feel the tension thickening in the air, like the calm before a storm, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting for what would happen next. Her father's hands clenched into fists, his knuckles white with the effort of trying to control his emotions. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He had never been the type to show weakness, but now, standing in front of Sarah, all his bravado seemed to have melted away. The man who had cast her aside, the man who had promised to protect her and failed, was now standing in the shadow of the truth. "Don't speak," Sarah said, her voice quiet but firm. "There's nothing left for you to say. You had your chance when I was a child. You had your chance when I needed you. But you chose to turn away from me, from your own flesh and blood, and now the consequences are yours to bear." Her words were like daggers, each one piercing deeper than the last. Sarah could see the pain and regret in her father's eyes, but she wasn't moved by it. She wasn't here for sympathy or apologies. She was here for justice. She was here to make sure everyone knew the truth. "And you." Sarah turned her gaze to the bride, whose face had paled further. The woman was standing there, shaking, her eyes darting nervously around the room as if she could somehow escape the consequences of her own actions. "You've been part of this all along. You thought I wouldn't come back, that you could live your life without paying for what you did to me. But you were wrong." The bride's face twisted with guilt, but Sarah wasn't finished. She had come too far to let them get away with it now. "You've hidden behind your perfect little life, pretending that nothing ever happened. But I see you. I see the truth, and the town will see it too. This wedding, this life you've built, is nothing but a lie." The tension in the room was palpable now, and Sarah could feel the eyes of the guests burning into her. She knew that they were all beginning to understand the full weight of what she was saying. No one could deny it any longer. The truth was out, and there was no turning back. Her heart pounded as she stood there, feeling the weight of the moment settle in. She had come back to Oakwood to confront the people who had hurt her, the people who had turned their backs on her, and she was finally making them face the consequences of their actions. For the first time in years, Sarah felt a sense of power, power that had been denied to her for so long. The lies, the shame, the betrayal, they had all been buried for too long. But now, the truth was rising, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. As Sarah stood in the center of the room, the weight of her words hanging heavy, a strange sense of liberation washed over her. The years of anger, hurt, and isolation had built up inside her, and now they were spilling out, unraveling everything. Her father, the man who had once been her hero, was no longer the powerful figure he had once been. The facade was broken, and as Sarah's eyes met his, she saw something she hadn't expected: fear. He looked lost, desperate even, as if he realized for the first time that he had underestimated her. His grip on the pew was still tight, his knuckles still white, but it wasn't just the shock of her words that had shaken him. It was the realization that she had the power now. "You don't get to hide anymore," Sarah said softly, but with conviction. Her voice rang with the truth she had carried for so long. "You don't get to pretend that everything is fine. You made your choices, and now you will live with them." The guests were now whispering among themselves, their murmurings like the wind before a storm, and Sarah could hear the nervous shuffling of their feet. Everyone was on edge, unsure how to react, but Sarah was beyond that now. She had already set the course of this evening. The truth had been spoken, and nothing could erase it. The bride, still standing in front of the altar, finally spoke, her voice shaking. "You're lying. This isn't what you think." But Sarah cut her off. "You think you can gaslight me too? You think you can tell me I'm lying when I've lived through the hell you put me through? No, I'm not lying. You've been a part of this, from the very beginning." The bride's face drained of color. Her lips quivered as she tried to hold on to whatever dignity she had left. But it was clear to everyone now. The woman who had once seemed so perfect was crumbling under the weight of her own guilt. And then, as if on cue, Sarah's eyes locked on something she had been waiting for: the confirmation. Her father's eyes flickered for just a second. That moment, that brief flash of recognition, was everything. It was the moment he knew Sarah wasn't just talking about the past. She was talking about something far worse, something buried deep. Sarah didn't have to say it out loud. The silence in the room spoke for her. The truth was worse than any of them had imagined. Her father and the bride had been involved in a scandalous affair, a secret that had remained hidden for years. They had both been complicit in the betrayal, not just of Sarah, but of each other, lying to themselves, to the town, and to their families. The room erupted in chaos. Guests murmured, gasped, and some even began to shuffle toward the exits, unable to handle the weight of the truth being exposed. Sarah didn't care. She didn't need them to stay. She had already done what she came to do. Her father's face was an unreadable mask now, but it was clear that he knew the truth had been exposed. There was no hiding anymore. The lies had all unraveled, and as Sarah turned to leave, she felt a strange sense of peace wash over her. This was no longer about vengeance. It was about finally being free, free from the past, free from the shackles they had placed on her. She had returned, not to destroy them, but to show them that they could no longer control her. The truth had set her free, and there was nothing they could do to take that away. As Sarah walked out of the church, her head held high, she felt as though a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. For years she had lived in the shadow of her father's decisions, the quiet shame of her past hovering over her every move. But now, that darkness was gone, shattered by the force of the truth she had unleashed. The storm outside seemed to reflect the turmoil she had just caused inside. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and the rain poured down harder, washing away the remnants of the day, as if nature itself was cleansing her soul. She knew the aftermath of her confrontation would be messy. The town would be talking for weeks, maybe months, but that was something she would leave behind. This was her moment to walk away, to reclaim her life, her identity, and, most importantly, her future. There would be no more looking over her shoulder, no more pretending that the past didn't exist. The lies had been exposed, and nothing would ever be the same. As she reached the car parked outside, her thoughts wandered to her child, the baby she had raised alone, the one whose future she had fought for every day. It had been a hard road, lonely at times, filled with doubts and fears, but she had done it. She had survived. And now, she would ensure her child would never know the same pain she had endured. But even as she prepared to leave the chaos behind, Sarah couldn't help but feel a strange pull back toward the church. Her father's face, his expression of helplessness, lingered in her mind. He had been a man who had once held all the power, a man who had seemed untouchable. But in that moment, as she had looked into his eyes, she saw the cracks in his armor. He had always believed he could control everything, everyone, but he had underestimated her. She had been the one person he couldn't control, and as much as she wanted to walk away and leave Oakwood in the past, she knew there would be unfinished business. There would be consequences to her actions, and the people who had wronged her wouldn't be able to simply move on. But she didn't care anymore. Sarah had spent too long worrying about their comfort, their secrets. Now it was her turn to live. Just as she opened the door to the car, a figure stepped out from the shadows, blocking her way. It was the groom, the man who had been standing at the altar, the man who had played a role in her father's betrayal. His eyes were filled with something between regret and resolve, and for a moment Sarah almost felt pity for him. "You can't just walk away," he said, his voice low but steady. "You can't leave it like this." Sarah narrowed her eyes, her hand gripping the door handle. "I'm done. This isn't my battle anymore." The groom stepped closer, his expression softening. "But it's not over. Not for any of us." For a brief moment, Sarah felt a twinge of uncertainty. Had she made the right choice? Was there more to this story than she realized? But she quickly shook off the thought. There was no more room for doubt. She had fought her battle and won. With one final glance at the man who had been caught in the lies of others, Sarah closed the car door and drove off into the storm, leaving the past and everyone who had hurt her behind. The storm raged outside, but inside Sarah's car, the world had never felt so quiet. The windshield wipers swished rhythmically, the sound almost soothing as she sped down the rain-soaked road, away from the town, away from the past. The weight that had once seemed so unbearable now felt lighter, like she had finally shed the chains of guilt and regret that had bound her for so long. But even as she drove, Sarah knew this wasn't the end of the story. It couldn't be. The truth had been exposed, but the ripples of what had happened would be felt for years to come. Her father, the bride, the guests, they all had their own battles to face now, their own truths to confront. And as much as she longed for peace, Sarah couldn't help but wonder what would become of them. Would they ever truly change? Would they ever feel the weight of what they had done? She glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the lights of a car following her, but there was nothing. The road behind her was empty, yet a part of her still felt the pull, the lingering doubts. It was as though she could still hear their voices, still feel the weight of their expectations pressing on her shoulders, even from miles away. Sarah's thoughts wandered back to her child. The one thing she knew for certain was that she would protect them, no matter what. She wouldn't let her child grow up in a world of lies and deceit. The things she had experienced would not define their future. Sarah had spent years running from her past, but now she was going to build a future that was hers, one that was free from the shadows of the people who had wronged her. The rain began to lighten, the storm easing as the miles between her and Oakwood grew. The storm inside her was quieter now, too. There was still anger, still hurt, but it no longer consumed her. She had faced the people who had tried to control her, and she had won. She had reclaimed her story. But as Sarah continued to drive, she felt something unexpected stir within her, a sense of power. It wasn't the power she had once craved, the power of revenge or the desire to make them suffer. No, it was a different kind of power, the kind that came with knowing that she was in control of her own destiny now, the kind that came with the realization that she didn't need anyone's approval, anyone's validation to be whole. As the headlights of her car cut through the darkness, Sarah looked ahead at the open road before her. It stretched out, endless, full of possibilities. She didn't know where it would take her, but for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid. She was free. The road was hers to choose.